Chicago professors tried to break a black student, but he proved he was more brilliant than all of them. At the University of Chicago, the morning began chilly, with an icy wind whipping snow dust along the walls of the old building. The huge lecture hall, with a seating capacity of 200, filled slowly. Students were streaming in from the frozen streets, clutching laptops, notebooks, and hot coffee in plastic cups. The linear algebra department was famous for its strict rules, but today's lecture promised much more than just study hours. Right in the center of the amphitheater at the lectern stood Professor Julian Foster, a tall, gaunt man with a cold stare. His name had long been synonymous with toughness, and his manner of teaching was the living embodiment of university selection. In student circles, his lectures were called nothing less than selection for survival. Foster did not hide his position. In the world of mathematics, there is no place for the weak, the random, or the insufficiently gifted. If you are here, prove that you are worthy. Otherwise, leave. Today's lecture was special not only because of the topic, complex transformations and structures. Not only students were seated in the front row. Several professors from other departments, math, physics, even economics, sat next to Foster, talking discreetly. They had come not so much for knowledge as for the performance for which their colleague was famous. Foster had a knack for demonstrating how, in a few minutes, he could crush the ambitions of any student who thought linear algebra was easy. When the hall was almost full, the doors opened silently and Jason Brooks entered the auditorium. He wouldn't have stood out from the crowd except for one thing. Against the backdrop of the bright hall and the glistening snow outside the windows, his dark skin and reserved posture drew the eye. A gray hooded sweatshirt, simple jeans, a neat notebook in his hands, nothing hinted at a desire to draw attention to himself. But he didn't need it. Jason walked silently up the steps, taking a seat in the middle of the hall, and as if on cue, several heads turned to follow him. There was everything in their gazes: curiosity, skepticism, anticipation. After all, there was only one place for a newcomer from the street in this class, at the bottom of the list, where they crossed off those who failed. Foster noticed him almost immediately. His eyes slid across the classroom, stopping on Jason. A thin grin slid across his lips. Turning to a colleague sitting next to him, he threw in a low voice, "Someone decided to try their luck again." The words were spoken in a low voice, but in the absolute silence of the hall, they were heard by many. A few professors in the front row exchanged brief glances, and someone even gave a faint nod as if in agreement. The students next to them shivered, but no one turned around. That wasn't the way it was done around here. Jason didn't react. He calmly opened his notebook, carefully placed his pen on his lap, and continued to watch the pulpit. Foster slowly made his way to the blackboard, picked up a marker, and without turning around, tossed to the audience, "Well, let's see who's wasting their time here today." His tone was as icy as the air outside the windows. A tense silence hung inside the auditorium. Even those who had come simply to take notes for the lecture sensed that today promised something more than an ordinary class. It was like a performance where the audience knew the ending in advance, but still couldn't take their eyes off the stage. No one believed that the guy in the gray sweatshirt would stay in this class for long. No one except Jason. Foster began his lecture without any unnecessary introductions. The marker in his hand moved quickly and sharply, leaving chains of matrix expressions on the blackboard. He wrote freely, confidently, as if he were creating something elementary, though for most students each line was a vague abracadabra. The matrices cluttered with parentheses and multiplication marks added up to a system that hid a trick. This was a standard part of his method, though. Almost no one in the audience had time to follow the logic of the conclusion, let alone comprehend each line. Foster always preferred to beat the odds, set problems in which the error was masked among cumbersome expressions, and see which students could at least spot the catch. Students were frantically taking notes, notebook pages rustling, notebook keys strobing at top speed. Some rewrote mechanically, some tried to absorb, some gave up after the first line. Foster wrote faster than most could comprehend. No one risked asking a question. "That's not the way it works here. If you don't get it, it's your problem." Jason Brooks sat, taking his time, writing down only the key elements. His eyes slid carefully over the formula. He didn't make any unnecessary movements, didn't take his eyes off the blackboard. The professor's words were drowning in the background. He had already mentally divided the equation into parts. On the third line something didn't match. At first he thought he'd made a mistake himself. He figured out the order of multiplication. Checked it again. And again it didn't add up. Foster made a classic but insidious mistake. He mixed up the order of multiplication of two matrices. It was an almost imperceptible mistake, typical of haste, but in the end it completely changed the solution. Jason felt his fingers squeeze the pen slightly. He hesitated. Memories of high school came back to him, when he had once pointed out a mistake to a teacher and been the subject of ridicule. He was then politely explained that, "You should not be clever," and after the lesson, made it clear that for such antics will not be a good life. Even though a lot of time had passed since then, that scene had left a deeper mark than he'd like to admit. Jason stared at the board for a long time, his mind spinning with the same thought. Should I? Foster continued to write without noticing. The professors in the front row watched the process with lazy interest. The atmosphere in the hall became viscous, as if someone had pulled an invisible string between the chair and everyone present. Everyone was waiting for a mistake, but no one expected it to be called out loud. Jason took a breath. His fingers trembled slightly, but he raised his hand. A second and the hall seemed to freeze. Those sitting around him quickly glanced in his direction. Even the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. He spoke calmly but loudly enough. "Professor, there seems to be an error in the matrix multiplication here." No unnecessary words, no emotion. Just a statement of fact. Foster did not turn around immediately. For a few seconds he remained with his back to the audience, as if the words didn't concern him. Then he slowly put the marker down on the stand, turned and looked straight at Jason. There was no surprise or annoyance in his gaze. More like cold interest, as if he were observing a new insect under the glass of a microscope. He bowed his head slightly, took a step to the side and without raising his voice threw it back. "Since you're so sure, go out and show everybody the right way." Foster said it casually, but there was something in his tone that everyone realized. This was a trap. The words were said not to test knowledge, but to make the insolent man look ridiculous. It was what he always did. And it always worked. Jason stood up. His movement was calm, not defiant. He took only his pen with him and walked to the board, feeling hundreds of stares on him. The short space between his chair and the pulpit seemed longer than the entire university campus. He walked over, took a marker, erased the wrong part and carefully wrote down the correct multiplication. Unhurriedly. Clearly. Line by line, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to do. No defiance, no bravado. Just rigorous, precise work. When he took a step back, there was a silence in the hall that could not be called ordinary. It was that special silence when it was clear to everyone that the rules of the game were changing. Rumors spread across campus faster than the formulas erased on the blackboard had time to cool. The rumors varied. Some claimed that Foster had set the whole thing up on purpose to test the new student. Others whispered that Jason had noticed the mistake for a reason, as if someone had tipped him off beforehand. But most agreed that something had gone wrong that day. Foster had allowed the student to go to the board and get out of that fight without humiliation. And that in itself was a sensation. Discussions erupted in the library, in coffee lines, in empty classrooms after class. Jason Brooks's name, for the first time, became louder than a whisper. That evening, on his way to the reading room, Jason noticed a guy about 25 years old approaching him. Tall, with glasses and a slight carelessness in his movements, he stopped next to him and looked at Jason appraisingly. Edward Miller. A math major, known not only for his work, but also for being one of the few who wasn't afraid to speak openly about the unwritten rules of the department. Edward stood silent for a moment and then, without changing his facial expression, said quietly, "Foster doesn't leave such challenges so easily." There was no threat in his voice, but there was no hint of humor in it either. Jason responded with a slight nod and moved on, but that brief conversation lingered in his mind. The next few days were a test of Jason's mettle. In the first lecture after the incident, Foster, without saying his name, put an equation on the board that was so complicated that even the upperclassmen looked at it with bewilderment. The assignment seemed pointless, as if someone had deliberately inserted elements of unrelated topics into it. But Jason had figured it out. Not quickly, not playfully, but he built a solution and turned it in before the end of class. The answer was correct. At the next lecture, history repeated itself. Another assignment, another blatant trap. The students watched with interest and then with growing alarm. It was as if Foster was challenging not only Jason, but the very notion of being a student. Time after time he created assignments that looked like mathematical absurdity, but Jason kept at it. Coldly, methodically, without emotion. Then the subtle games began. Foster began throwing questions at the audience without naming names, but each time his gaze lingered on Jason. He made up problems as he went along, adding sarcastic comments like, "Well, maybe someone will solve this faster than me again today?" Or, "What if there's someone among us who thinks he's smarter than the professor?" The hall reacted with tense silence. Pairs of eyes kept turning to Jason, but he remained unperturbed. When asked directly, he answered calmly without challenge. His answers were precise, uncluttered. It annoyed Foster more than it would have if Jason had tried to argue. Edward came up to him from time to time between classes. No friendly conversation, just short, casual remarks. You continue to amaze. He's definitely not going to let up now. Jason didn't answer. He didn't need encouragement or sympathy. But every day he could feel the atmosphere around him changing more and more clearly. There was no longer the same sneer or skepticism in his classmates' eyes. There was something else, a mixture of anticipation and fear. They were waiting for Jason to break. Or for Foster to finally cross the line. It was in the evening, a week after the first call. Lectures were over, students were dispersing across campus. Jason was about to leave when he heard a steady voice behind him. "Brooks, my office." He turned around. Foster was standing at the lectern with his arms crossed over his chest. His face remained impenetrable. Jason nodded silently and followed. There was complete silence in the office, which was filled with books and blueprints. Foster sat at his desk, slowly thumbing through the pages of a folder. Then he looked up and said quietly, "If you like challenges so much, there's an international Olympiad in a month. Participate. Unless, of course, you're ready to take this game to the next level." Jason didn't respond. He knew it wasn't a suggestion. It was a challenge. And there was no backing down. After the conversation in Foster's office, it was as if Jason had turned off everything around him. The only route left was the library, the auditorium, and the library again. He began his mornings reading reference books, solved problems during the day, analyzed other people's solutions in the evening, and returned to his own notes at night. He wasn't interested in campus conversations, and even eating seemed to have ceased to be a big deal. He immersed himself in math as in an alien universe where preconceived notions, traps, and other people's expectations didn't exist. In the library on the second floor, he took a seat by the window that overlooked the snow-covered courtyard, and every day that desk remained behind him. At first those around him looked at him with curiosity, then warily, and then they just stopped paying attention. He sat at the books the longest, was the last to leave, sometimes fell asleep on the table, woke up and continued as if nothing had happened. By the third week his fanatical determination was noticed even in the dean's office. Assistants whispered among themselves that, "The guy from the first year is preparing as a graduate student before his thesis defense." Professors from other departments began sharing jokes in the hallways. "I wonder who will give up first, Brooks or Foster?" This joke quickly took on sarcastic variations. Not only faculty members but also students made bets, jokingly or seriously. Some were sure Jason would break under the pressure. Some thought it was just Foster's new method of burning out the weak. But Jason himself paid no attention to the words or the looks. He didn't look for support or answer oblique questions. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. All that mattered was in front of him: the formulas, the problems, the solutions. He didn't study for an exam or for competition. He was looking for weaknesses in his logic, testing himself, analyzing every mistake as if he were training not only his mind but also his character. Late one night, as the library was closing, he stood on the cold campus balcony, leaning against the railing, and for the first time in a long time he allowed himself to step out of the cycle a little. A familiar voice sounded in his ear, his mom. She didn't call often, trying not to bother. But this time she couldn't stand it. Her voice was quiet, anxious. She asked if he was pushing himself too hard, if it was dangerous to his health. She didn't say it directly, but Jason knew there was much more than concern behind those words. She was afraid he'd fall back into a situation where someone would decide to put him in his place just for going against the system. He was silent for a few seconds, listening to the connection crackle in the handset, and then calmly replied, "I have to do this. Not for their sake. For myself." And he himself was surprised at how natural it sounded. A few days before departure, preparations reached their peak. Jason didn't sleep much, checking one solution after another. He acted as if the Olympics weren't at stake, but something much more important. His face was sterner, his movements more precise, and his gaze even colder. It was a frosty morning on the morning of his departure for New York. Jason stood at the stairs of the main building holding a small backpack. Foster appeared unexpectedly, without the usual entourage of co-workers, without the mask of icy indifference. He came almost close, looked directly into his eyes and said quietly, so that no one could hear, "Let's see how long you last among the real geniuses." There was no threat in his voice, but rather a subtle mixture of challenge and icy calculation. Jason didn't answer. He just looked down at the snow-covered sidewalk as if he could see not the way to the bus, but the whole path ahead of him. The gigantic hall of the New York Convention Center resembled the amphitheater of ancient Rome. The rows of seats were packed to the brim with the best students from all over the world. MIT, Harvard, Princeton, Cambridge, Tokyo University. Hundreds of faces, cold, confident, not used to losing. No one spoke loudly, only rare short phrases, quick glances as between equal opponents before a fight. On the stage, a long jury table, at which sat professors with names that weighed more than university titles. Among them was Julian Foster. He sat up straight, arms crossed, eyes slowly gliding across the room. His gaze slid over the Harvard students, lingered on the MIT delegation and finally settled on Jason Brooks. He was sitting in the third row, calmly flipping through a notebook. Foster wasn't smiling. For the first time in all his years at the academy, he didn't feel the usual satisfaction at the spectacle to come. He was used to seeing students break under the weight of responsibility, under the pressure of impossible tasks, under their own ambitions. But now what he had thought impossible, the cold, dry anticipation of the outcome, had settled in him. The first round began, then the second. Jason solved the problems calmly, methodically, without any suddenness of movement or speed. He wasn't trying to be first, he was just solving. And every answer he gave was accurate. The judges looked at each other, the assistants brought the checked sheets to the stage. While the other competitors were losing momentum, Jason held his line. Final round. The host read out the terms. This was not just a complex equation or a system of integrals. It was a problem that no one had been able to solve at this Olympiad for 5 years in a row. It broke even experienced graduate students. There was a tense silence in the hall. Those who had come to watch froze in anticipation. This was not a tournament, it was a massacre of mental endurance. The terms were slowly displayed on a huge screen. A system of nonlinear equations with parameters changing in the process of solution was shown. It required not only knowledge of formulas, but also the ability to see structure where there should be none. Several participants started writing at once. Someone froze on the first line. Some looked at their notebooks, made a couple of notes and erased them. Jason read the condition carefully. 5, 10, 15 seconds. His hand remained still. He didn't make a single note. Foster watched him, head slightly bowed. 1 second. Another. Jason's gaze remained calm. And then he began to write. Not fidgeting, not looking away, mapping out the solution like a man who'd already seen it in its finished form. With each line, the formulas lay on the paper as if they were not in his control, as if he were simply opening them up like a known text. Those who sat near him involuntarily cast glances in his direction. First out of curiosity, then out of surprise. Jason wrote for less than 5 minutes. He made the last line, put his pen down beside him and leaned back in his chair. The scene froze. The judges looked at each other, one of them stood up and walked over to him. He took the sheet, ran his eyes over it. Another judge stood up and looked over his shoulder. Then a third. A whisper ran across the jury table. Several contestants looked up. Even those who thought they were favorites suddenly froze. Foster slowly lowered his hands to the table. His eyes expressed nothing but intense interest. When the judge raised his hand with Jason's sheet and said something briefly to his colleagues, the room froze again. The rising juror returned to the table, turned back to the audience and after a pause said, "This decision is not only right. It opens up a different path that no one has considered before." No applause, no shouting, no phones flashing. Silence. The kind that rings in your ears louder than any noise. In that silence, even breathing seemed a violation. Jason didn't smile, didn't turn toward anyone. He just sat there, staring ahead as if this was all just the normal outcome of an ordinary day. Foster stared at him for a long moment. His face remained impenetrable. But there was no longer the usual condescending sneer in that look. It was the look of a man who had seen for the first time that the truth was stronger than any prejudice. This victory had changed more than just Jason. It was a crack in a system where rules were dictated not by knowledge, but by fear of losing power. And in that silence, one thing became clear. This day will forever remain the moment when the entire hall realized that the time to play by the old rules was over. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.